Okay, everybody, a very warm welcome here from Słubice and Frankfurt-Oder, the twin cities at the borders between Germany and Poland. It's a big pleasure to welcome you all to this event of celebration where we're celebrating the publication of our special issue on data governance, digital innovation, grand challenges in information and organization. And you may wonder where this idea came from to hold a reception to celebrate the publication of something. It came from our good colleagues in political science who have these book launch parties that I found extremely fascinating, that they have actually a party when they publish something and they invite friends, family, and colleagues, and they celebrate that. And so the idea came up, hey, why not transport or import this format into IS and have a small reception here to get to talk about this special issue and present it to you. It's a big pleasure to welcome so many people on the call, and particularly here in our beautiful co-working space, which I'm sure you all can visit one day when you are about 5 meters into Poland. So you walk into Frankfurt-Oder, which is reasonably close to Berlin. You walk over a bridge and then you're in Poland, and there's our beautiful school where we're right now here in the co-working space, and we're welcoming a very international audience virtually, which is a great pleasure today to talk about the special issue. The agenda we have prepared for you is that we will have a few words of welcome from our esteemed director and professor of the sociology of technology, Jan-Henrik Passot, from I&O's editor-in-chief, Michael Barrett, from the University of Cambridge, as well as the special issue editors. And then we will move on to have short showcase presentations of the papers. Short presentations with a little bit of commentary from a colleague on the paper about what's particularly interesting from a data governance perspective. And then for those who are here in the co-working space after the discussion, we have a few drinks and snacks prepared for you, as you can see back there at the bar. But really, these are only for those that stay until the very end. So there's a little bit of incentive for you to stay into the evening. Let me welcome everybody very warmly, both virtually and in the co-working space. It's a great pleasure to see you all back here in the co-working space and to see so many great colleagues on the call tonight. It's really cool. And that being said, I would hand over to our director, Professor Jan-Henrik Passot, who's a sociologist of technology, focusing on post-A&T studies. He's, as of February this year, also the director of our school. And as of just, I guess, 10 days, the vice president of research of our whole university. So thank you for having us here in the co-working space. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Welcome also for me in this room. And wherever you are virtually in this world, my very pleasure to welcome you all to the very first reception we're having on a publication format here at ENS. We academics are always used to, well, basically put all we achieve just in reports and count them as future past merits for our upcoming grant proposals, and basically tick off boxes and put stuff away. And it's actually a really nice idea to stop from day to day and say, well, great accomplishment. There's a special issue published. We should probably be proud and do what other people who do things that they are proud of do, celebrate and drink. And what better way to do this as academics than to actually listen to papers and discuss them in a room full of other interested academics. So that's actually a wonderful format to cultivate and celebrate in the near future for future and upcoming publication projects as well. It's my very pleasure to a topic such as digital innovation and grand challenges is the first topic that we're doing this with, and it's also a pleasure that this is one of the outcomes of a longer collaboration by my dear colleague Lauri Wessel and his esteemed colleagues in the information systems field, specifically leading to a special issue, hopefully well read and hopefully well received and well cited pushing up our numbers for the next report as well. With this, I guess, let me just add some last final welcome and fun listening to talks and discussions, and a bit brings later on. With this, I give over to Michael Barrett, who probably will also welcome from the place he is currently. And I hope we can see him on the slides, actually. But
thank you
Michael,
very much.
Hopefully you're there.
I am. Can you hear me all right? Thank you so much.
I think so. Michael, good evening.
Good evening. It's good to be on the call and to welcome everyone.
Cool.
Thank you very much, Lauri and Jan Hendrik, for that very nice introduction. And it's really good to be on the call. I am joining from Cambridge in the UK, and it's a delight to see so many familiar faces on the call and new faces as well. And I just want to, first of all, say that, again, I will be waiting till after the session to toast with a glass of wine and to thank very much the guest editors, Lauri Wessel, Elizabeth Davidson, Susan Winter and Jenifer Winter, for this really very important and timely special issue, and with so many great authors, and I'm sure it will be well cited. So thank you on behalf of Information Organization. I was asked to say a few words about Information Organization before starting. I think that's always a good thing. There may be some new authors on the call that might want to know more about the journal. So allow me just a few minutes to share where we're going and what we're about as a journal, and then go into the meat of the different presentations and the discussions, which I'm looking forward to. Next slide, please, Lauri. So just a little bit about the Information Organization and its strategic positioning in the IS and organizational theory field. As one person mentioned, it might have been Lauri or Liz, the ampersand between Information Organization is a wonderful symbol of the boundary spanning and the boundary object that we as a journal endeavor to provide to the field, so that we can have great crossover and fertilization of information systems and organizational theory and broader management scholars who have a passion for technology and digital technologies to explore the field with us together. So as you'll see there, we're at the intersection of communication, digital technologies, and organizations. And we do have a particular focus because there's not a lot of space in the field at the moment, though there is some great work being done in other journals for publishing high quality, qualitative and interpretive research. We certainly do publish other research, but this is a particular focus for us in developing novel and theoretical contributions using empirical research based on case studies, ethnographic work, and the like. And the last point there is that we also have a passion in the journal for both research articles and articles which allow you to express what you believe your message from the research is in having a wider impact to policy and practice. And we call that section, which is an ongoing section, the RIC section, standing for Research Impact and Contributions to Knowledge. And there's more about that section on the web, and it's one that I'd love you to look at. Next slide. Now, indeed, in terms of a little bit more on our strategic positioning, Lauri, you've summed it up so nicely in your introduction by talking about the political scientists that are helping us learn about doing more celebrations of our work through book launch parties. And now we're doing one with a special issue. We've actually done one in the past, but we will continue to do them. We seek to be innovative. We seek to be interdisciplinary and impactful in the way in which we develop research with other fields, as I mentioned just now, and in a wider sense of thinking about our work beyond the academic realm. Next slide, please. And so just to highlight and reinforce the point about the interdisciplinary nature of the journal, we do have a lot of scholarship blending from information systems and organizational theory and beyond. And indeed, all of those scholars are trying to develop our knowledge of this fast-moving contemporary digital phenomenon. And so the idea of the journal having a history of bold new ideas and theories is well recognized and will continue. And indeed, for the last 5 years, we had a great success in providing through the RIC section opportunities for academics to bridge, as I said, academia with practice and policy. And this special issue is no exception in terms of having grand challenges and having research articles as well as more practice-facing articles, which have a strong, interesting conceptual contribution to them. Next slide, please. I'm delighted to share and to make sure you do know that we are in what's called the Senior Scholars Basket by the AIS, which is a very important association in our field. Just to let you know that Senior Scholars Basket might now be called in the future the Senior Scholars List of Premier Journals, of which Information and Organization is a part of that. For a long time, it's been established as an A-star journal in Australasia. A recent ranking in Germany, especially given that the hosts are locally enjoying their beers shortly there. It's very well recognized as an A ranking in a new meta ranking, a rating, sorry, of the BWL 2023. And indeed, there are many universities and some, whether it's NYU, Cambridge, Texas Austin, that recognize the journal for its longevity of providing high quality IS qualitative research. Next slide, please. Just very briefly on the impact of the journal, you know, we have a high impact factor. We're a little bit down in the 5.3 range at the moment, but we've well recognized as providing both impactful and well cited papers, of which I am sure this special issue will contribute to keeping our very good history in that department strong. So just to show you some quick stats there, but to move on in the interest of time. Just to share a couple of examples here of articles which show a lot about the character of the journal and where it's been so strong. So if you'll see there, qualitative research, very heavily cited and highly cited by key authors in the field. The first article, Myers and Newman, and then a number of some of the really important theoretical directions, whether it's sociomateriality, as we see with the next couple of, the next article with Leonardi and Bardi, or Leonardi, or more recently, developing even more strongly the way in which we can look at and understand how institutional theory and digitization is helping us understand our contemporary digital phenomenon. And so whether it's really strong methods on qualitative research or for new exciting theoretical directions, the journal has a lovely history in that regard. And the last one is a RIC paper, as well as actually the Heinings et al. Was also a RIC paper, just showing the new shoots of types of scholarship, which is also doing extremely well. Next slide, please. And so now I want to finish off and give back the floor to Lauri and Elizabeth and Susan and Jenifer shortly, just to highlight some of the special issues. The one that we're celebrating tonight, which we will focus on, data governance, digital innovation, grand challenges. Extremely timely. And I think we're probably, having a special issue together, we'll see more of these very shortly. We'll hear more about that very soon. But the other two which are ongoing, there is the digital innovation platforms and global strategy, and digital technology, societal change, and institutional logics. Let me just say briefly a little bit about those two, and then hand back to Lauri and colleagues. This is one that I'm helping to run with. Actually, Daniel Logue is the managing guest editor. And with Anna Roberts, Peter Williamson, and myself, we had a workshop which was very successful in December, and we are now taking submissions and processing them just in the last week or two. And just to say, the objective here was very much to enrich our theoretical repertoire by bringing together key scholars and those that are interested to contribute to the intersection of information systems and international business. through a focus on platforms, so digital innovation and global strategy, and with a big thrust, but not a sole thrust, on digital platforms. So you'll see the range of topics that we are looking at in that special issue. It should be out in a year from now. So look forward to that, those articles. And if you are still interested and you have something which is already very well developed, we are stopping taking submissions for this special issue June 15. So there is still some time if you'd like to submit to this special issue. The second one I want to mention briefly, next slide please, is another exciting special issue on digital technology, societal change, and institutional logics. And that's with Isam Feik, Eva Oborn, Thomas Gegenhuber, Patricia Thornton. And again, what we traditionally do, if you're interested in a special issue, we need very strong topics which are going to make an impact on the field. We workshop them or have them as sub-themes. In this case, it was EGOS 2022. It can be any of the IS conferences as well. And again, the objectives there, as you can see, is really to advance our research on institutional theory in the study of IS phenomenon, and looking at specifically at societal level change. So we're excited about that special issue. We have a number of scholars very well known and represented on both the information systems and organizational theory and management field who are contributing to this special issue. So as I mentioned, one of the main works, actually, which Heinings et al., which is already at 1,000 almost citations and published in 2018 in Information Organization, has been a very important foundation block for continuing this important work within the journal. That's all I'm going to say about those special issues, because we want, and we are here to celebrate the fantastic special issue on data governance, digital innovation, and grand challenges. And then back to Liz, Lauri, Jenifer, and Susan, and many thanks for such a wonderful contribution to the journal. Over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael, for those very kind words. Let us also speak some warm words of welcome here from the special issue editors. So I'm Lauri Wessel. I'm Professor of Information Management and Digital Transformation here at the European New School of Digital Studies, which is a transdisciplinary school focused on studying digital transformation of society from a transdisciplinary perspective. So differing from the traditional German model of a faculty where you have several chairs in, say, business. We have a chair in sociology of technology. So our dean and colleague Jan is holding this chair. We have Philipp Hacker, who holds a chair in law and ethics of the digital society. And Ulrike Klinger holds the chair of digital democracy and political theory. Very recently we appointed Migle Baray-Kütte as an assistant professor in digital studies with a strong background in cultural studies. So we're approaching these topics from a very transdisciplinary perspective. But maybe also my co-editors can say a few words of welcome here. So over to Liz, Jenifer, and Susan.
Thank you, Lauri. You're challenging Jenifer and I. It's quite early in the morning here in beautiful Honolulu, Hawaii, but we are glad to be joining you across the continent as well as the ocean. And thank you all for attending. It's great to see such a crowd of people online to learn more about our special issue, to talk to each other. One of the things about being a global community, and especially since much of this work was done during the pandemic shutdowns where people were not traveling, is to see our group of authors online, to see many of the authors of these papers, and an opportunity to express our appreciation for the authors for their submissions, for working with us as editors to continually revise and improve the papers. It's really we're really so proud and happy that we were able to publish all of your papers and to include them in this topic, which we think is so important. So aloha.
Hi all, I'm Jenifer Sunrise Winter from the University of Hawaii as well. And like Liz, I'm very thrilled to see you all here today. And I want to send my special appreciation also to all of the authors who have been so wonderful throughout this process. it's very exciting to see the special issue come to fruition. And I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the event. Thank you very much.
And I'm Susan Winter, unrelated to Jenifer. But similar to Jenifer and Elizabeth, I will not be starting drinking at the end of this program, since I'm actually in Maryland, which puts it at noon. And they frown on having a liquid lunch here. So I'm actually the Associate Dean for Research here in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. And again, on the theme of interdisciplinarity, this is not a business school, not a sociology department. It's actually not departmentalized, and we really look at issues at the confluence of information, technology, and people. My expertise and interest is in the coevolution of technology and work practices. And so that made this a really interesting special issue to work on with Lauri and with Elizabeth and Jenifer, because we all came at it from somewhat different perspectives, and were able to look at the papers and say, well, how does this speak to the literatures that we know? And so I've done a lot of work in, as Michael mentioned, the RIC, the research impact and contribution to knowledge area, because work practices are very practical. And I've long been interested in data, as we're seeing the transformation of publication, and we're seeing transformations in the way that people do research, work practices. It turns out research is a kind of work. And much of the interesting action is happening in the middle, which is with data, with how do you store it, how do you manage it, how do you deal with it. So from a research perspective, data is a really exciting area. And I think also in theory and in business, really data has come to the fore as an important area in probably the last 5 to 10 years. So it's a really exciting and timely issue. And I thank my co-editors for inviting me to be a part of this process.
All right, great. The way we will further develop this evening is that we will have short presentations of the papers, and I will start with a brief presentation of the editorial article that sets the tone for the special issue and is supposed to give you an understanding of what we were aiming for thematically with our call for papers that we published in, I think it was early 2001, in the heyday of the pandemic. In Germany, first persons were vaccinated, but everything was more or less still remote and closed down, which when you live in a city like Berlin, which tends to be never sleeping, it's a strange feeling. And what better example than the pandemic to showcase and make concrete what it means to think about data governance and digital innovation and grand challenges. Because data, of course, was in many, many ways very central to responding to the pandemic. All the Germans in the room can relate to the Corona app, which they have now actually closed down as of 2 weeks ago. But it was one of the key aspects of contact tracing and finding out, have I been in contact, yes or no? But there's myriads of other ways where we saw data really being at the center of policy, practice, and research. And everybody who's listened to the Corona podcast, always data was central: incidence rates, likelihoods of infection, etc., etc. Data. It seemed to be all about data. Yet COVID-19 was one example for many of the grand challenges we as global and European societies face, particularly here at the intersection of Germany and Eastern Europe. And data is indeed central, if you look at what happens out there, to finding effective responses to many of the challenges that we're facing. That was one of the key motivations for why we wanted to get this special issue together. And then turning to IS literature, of course, data governance is a topic that has been researched for quite some time. Data governance, or sometimes called information governance, has been a key concern for scholars looking into IT strategy and IS strategy, with the key idea being that data have to be seen as a corporate asset that is of tremendous value for competitive advantage. this research has, of course, accelerated in recent years with smart service systems, big data, artificial intelligence, and all these things becoming what some call the new oil for companies out there. And still, we thought, let's push this research a bit further. Let's go beyond organizational and corporate boundaries. Because, again, as the contact tracing shows, it is not only about using data for the profit of companies or organizations, but it's about the questions that relate to societal grand challenges, where we have to essentially rethink how we as a society deal with data, which raises all sorts of governance questions, some of which earlier research speaks to, but many where it doesn't speak to. And that was the second central aspect that we wanted to address, that we're really only beginning to ask data governance questions that loom beyond organizational boundaries. If you look into recent and very valuable literature reviews on the topic, you'll see that there is sort of this frontier is emerging. Corporations have to deal with data that comes from the outside, but also societies have to deal with all sorts of data. We have individual questions, we have organizational questions, policy questions, and many other things that push further the frontiers and boundaries of how we should consider data. And here are a few aspects that I'd like to highlight that we start to talk about in the special issue, yet we also believe they open new playing fields that research on data governance should look into. So one aspect is new levels of analysis. As I tried to highlight when talking about earlier literature with the organization level, data governance in this day and age also raises questions at the societal level, which you could say is a macro level question. So what Philip has been researching into, what are effective governmental responses, policies that relate to data, data sharing, data creation, and recently, of course, generative large language models, big societal questions. Then we also have micro level questions, so individual level questions. For example, what sort of data are we allowing to be collected by all the services we use? I'm sure everybody of you used Spotify already today or some news app. The question, what data do we allow those applications and companies actually to collect from us? And here you begin to see how these levels are interconnected. If we would allow to say that most of the research on an organization level sits somewhere between society and us as individuals, you could see it as a meso-level argument that is increasingly intertwined with micro and macro levels. The questions like what sort of data are you giving to the companies whose services you're consuming clearly relates to meso-level arguments, whereas the question, what are the consequences of widespread use of your data by companies, then is a macro level consequence of what organizations actually do. And here's where we see important frontiers to emerge to consider these new levels of analysis. And there's also new organizational forms of data governance. New roles are emerging. We know about data ownership. The questions of data ownership reoccur in the day and age of ChatGPT and other applications that increasingly that strongly draw on data. How to organize open data for digital innovation. Many applications are trained on open data sets. And then the question is, how do you move from open data to actually profiting from the applications you've developed? It's an important question. I've recently talked to an entrepreneur from the Berlin area, and he said, jokingly said, well, open AI is becoming closed AI. That's sort of true or was clear for him because he was seeing them having a profit interest. And that was, I guess, a very colloquial example for this larger question. So how do we actually organize this transition from open data to actors having perhaps even a legitimate interest of making a margin with the products they developed? Equity and fairness in data governance. I think we have recently heard a lot about ChatGPT hallucinating. So when you ask ChatGPT certain questions, recently I asked ChatGPT, what is the European New School of Digital Studies? ChatGPT got it right to say it's a transdisciplinary research institute, yet it located us close to the Chiemsee in southern Bavaria, where I guess it was wishful thinking. It was wishful thinking, okay, but it was still, I guess you could call it hallucinating, and which is again a bit of a funny example, but then it illuminates to this bigger issue of what data are they trained on and how are they combining what to generate responses that you raise. But the other questions that arise, particularly in the context of machine learning, what data has been used to train the models, and what fairness and ethical considerations result from that. It's an important question about equity and fairness that relate to data governance. And lastly, as data governance and grand challenges considered in conjunction are questions that demand interdisciplinary collaboration and collaboration among diverse actors, we also see a lot of potential in engaging closer with academic practitioner relationships. And Michael mentioned the RIC section, to think about our research, not only in terms of how does it drive theory forward, but how can we actually design new applications, new ideas that help with finding responses to these questions. And recently, I came across this really interesting approach that said, let's rethink design science, so classical procedural models of IS design, but what would it mean to design IS in the context of grand challenges? Essentially, it means to rethink these classical models. And I think it's a very interesting way forward that we also see here, and a lot of potential for exciting research, for important research, or research that will be helpful to society in this day and age, where I find it to be much more insecure, or I sense a much stronger feeling of insecurity than I sensed a few years ago. With all many of the grand challenges currently happening at the same time and having tremendous impact on our lives. That being said, I am very excited to welcome you all here tonight and give you a brief overview of the papers in the special issue. I'm happy to share the slides afterwards, so you can directly click on those links if you want to read the papers. Besides our editorial article, there's an exciting paper by Lars Hornoff and colleagues of data donation, so a micro-level study, where do you donate your data? Then a study in the Norwegian healthcare context about data governance spaces, which more relates to different levels of analysis, so clearly a macro question, or one question where the macro level matters. And a great paper that has a more historical perspective by Sirka Järvenpää and Anna Essen, and Thomas Gegenhuber's et al.'s paper on open social innovation and the topic of hackathons, data governance and secondary use of data, which I guess is a very, very important topic. For example, when you look into healthcare, how do you repurpose data from one context to the other? And an important paper by Gregory Vial on data governance and digital innovation, which raises the importance of practitioner issues for IS research. I'm keeping my statements about these papers short because we will see all of them presented in short follow-up presentations. Just wanted to give you an overview of the contributions we have in the special issue, as well as an indication that the future holds a lot of potential. Two papers have recently been published also in INO that take up and further elaborate on the spirit of the special issue. The one is achieving voluntary data sharing and cross-sector partnerships, very important contribution also to the data governance debate, as well as very recently a paper about knowledge monopolies and the innovation divide, which takes a more critical, you could say provocative perspective on challenging and teasing out the debate a little bit of and highlighting perhaps the unforeseen or some undesirable consequences of ubiquitous datafication. That being said, I'm very happy to welcome a short commentary on our editorial article by our recently appointed assistant professor, Migle Baray-Kütte. So Migle has already had a presentation right before this about data practices. So I'm very thankful that you agreed to give even another presentation.
Yes,
right after that.
Happy to talk all the time. Yeah, congratulations with the special issue. Yeah, as you just mentioned, you've asked me to provide a brief comment of this introductory article, by sort of considering the article, its key arguments, and the future research questions. So yeah, I'm very new to NS and have been here for basically a few weeks. I'm still learning about what my colleagues are researching. So after reading the article, I kind of found it somewhat uncanny how the special issue, or at least the introductory paper, also relates to my own research interests in situated data research that we'll also just heard a little bit about. So this means that I enjoyed reading this article a lot and was pleasantly also surprised by its density. And I commend the authors for taking a complex approach to data governance, in particular by trying to extend the information studies view of governance for sort of one organization to an ecosystem of stakeholders, but also by considering, as Lauri just mentioned, the micro-individual approaches to data governance, where individual knowledge about data is also crucial. And also for problematizing the need for new and fair organizational forms of data governance and the fostering of collaboration between different stakeholders to sort of gain different perspectives, especially when data resources are shared between multiple actors. So I come from a mixed background of communication, media studies, and political theory, and in recent years have worked kind of predominantly on qualitative empirical research approaches using fieldwork to explore digital developments, algorithmic accountability, as well as platform economies. And in fact, in qualitative empirical media studies and social studies more broadly, there has been quite a lot of research done to conceptualize and empirically explore data usage in specific contexts and to analyze the problems associated with big data, like algorithmic management misuses or algorithmic accountability. And such research also analyzes how data is produced and used in different places and settings, how data collection and use practices are or are not understandable to different stakeholders, for example, to users of smart devices in their private spaces or to algorithmically managed platform workers in their working environments. So these and related debates are happening in empirical discussions in the media and digital studies. And this is why I find it very interesting that the authors of the introductory article also see data not as a neutral or raw entity, but also as a contingent political entity that depends on the sides and interests of its production, dissemination, and use. And the perspective of the introductory article opens up spaces, I think, for more qualitative and situated instead of universally applicable research on data governance, and also discloses such research for interdisciplinary collaborations with other disciplines that also move in this direction in researching data practices, data politics. And I guess one of the important questions for future research from this insight are the methodological questions and methodological compatibility, sort of flexibility and openness in doing such complex governance research, also in an interdisciplinary way. I also find very interesting and fruitful the point made in the article that data governance research and practice is collaboration between different stakeholders from different fields of life to gain more qualitatively different perspectives for both research and practice. So while the authors are interested in exploring sort of how different interests can be aligned to address grand challenges through data innovation, I also wonder if future research could also consider spaces for non-aligned interests and conflicts within data governance practices, as we can already see in data politics around the gig economy, but those who use, develop, and are managed by algorithmic systems have very different interests that may perhaps never be aligned. So I wonder then if the question of conflict and contradiction might also be maintained in the future research on data governance. Third, I also find it valuable the point that data has potential to contribute to societal well-being, for example, in the context of COVID. Another pretty common example, I think, in Europe that comes at least to my mind is Estonia and its open data governance sort of success story. And it seems to me that through media, like in the newspapers or social media, we often hear about data misuse for commercial purposes that do not necessarily align with societal needs, also like Cambridge Analytica scandal, in Facebook scandal, mishandling social media, user data, digital disinformation, leaks, hacks, and so on. So for future research, I wonder what could be other examples of constructive multi-stakeholder cooperation that kind of goes beyond health data management and Estonia for that matter. What other successful data governance examples are there in the world that would help address grand challenges and perhaps shift the still common narrative, at least in Germany, of caution toward data politics and governance? Are there perhaps more unknown success stories in the realm of data governance that would actually contribute to the common good? And are such examples scalable to different places and cultures? what is common good. And related to this question, I wonder what are not only potential success stories of successful data governance, but also future trends of future misuses of data that data governance research beyond a single organization might be interested in exploring. And by innovative misuses, I mean like big data, digital disinformation, and so on. And to stress, I think the general outline and invitation of the introductory article, sort of focusing on these different levels of data governance and different stakeholders, their collaboration, emerging challenges, and perceiving data also situated, has a lot of potential to explore these and other questions. And a couple of more points and I finish. Another set of issues mentioned in the article that I found particularly interesting are related to digital accountability, consent and privacy debates, and also complicated notions of data ownership, also in the context of algorithmically managed data, where algorithmic systems are often privatized, too complex to be fully understood and opaque. The future research, which I suspect is moving towards more institutionalized data governance policies, at least in the European context, will be important in analyzing these crucial issues of accountability, fight against digital bias and discrimination, and the issues of data ownership, not only sort of as metaphors for policy papers, but also more or less successful governance practices. And finally, last sentence, we're at the NS, which is an interdisciplinary place that embraces different academics' perspectives and methods and values cooperation with practitioners from different sectors and countries, including and especially from Europe. I think it's a especially interesting place exactly due to these issues, as I've just mentioned, inter and transdisciplinary cooperation that considers European diversity. So thanks for the paper and good luck with the special issue.
Great. Thank you so much for the comment. And again, I really appreciate the presentation log for you today. Okay, good. Let's move on to the first empirical study published in the special issue, which is the social dilemma of big data, donating personal data to promote social welfare, by my good colleague and friend Lars Hornhoff. Lars and I met, I will never forget, 5 years ago when I was at the University of Bremen, and Lars back then was doing research on entrepreneurship, and I was trying to explain how IS works to him, because in Germany, of course, IS is often translated as Wirtschaftsinformatik, which has overlaps, but it's not entirely the same. And then I remember Lars came to work one day and said, look, I read this MISQ piece on transaction cost economics. Now I get what you're saying. I was like, okay, we just have to move you away from transaction cost economics, but good, I landed the point. So Lars, thank you so much for the submission. Thanks for pulling through the review process. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Good to have you here.
Thanks very much, Lauri. Actually, I thought you would tell a story about us going to a football game, but you talked about research, which is also fine. Yeah, thanks very much. First of all, for editing this special issue, to all of the guest editors, and for having our paper in this special issue. And so I have only 5 slides, so Lauri told me to speak for 5 minutes, so that's what I'm going to do. And the paper is about the social dilemma of big data and how donating personal data actually can promote social welfare. So first things first, you already mentioned a lot of examples, and it's probably not new to you that data is the new oil, but the question is that a good thing? And a couple of examples, for instance, from health have shown that it can be a good thing. For instance, if individuals are diagnosing breast cancer, they are pretty good. Computers are not so good, but if they are combined, they are actually excellent. And the same holds for vehicles and road transportation, meaning that if everyone would contribute their data, then you could actually reduce rush hours. There could be something like a public good where road congestions actually are decreased, but it requires that a lot of people are contributing. And the same as already mentioned before, in Germany, we have the Corona app, which has been closed down recently. But also in the US, we had different types of apps that have indicated whether other people got affected or not. And again, as you can see from all of these examples, what it requires and what is probably new, at least in our context, is that a lot of people have to contribute to benefit from a public good by donating their data. And this is different from what we have seen before, where people individually give their data, they get a benefit, they benefit from it, and they also bear a risk of leakage of their data. So why is data donations a social dilemma? Well, first of all, data donations can be beneficial for society, as you have just seen with the COVID apps and other examples like road coordination by big data. But at the same time, individuals have an incentive to deviate and not to donate their data because they face a privacy risk. So everyone would rather not donate their data and still benefit from the donation of others. So in this case, data donations for public good constituted a social dilemma. And so the public good that we are studying in our paper is a database which is very abstract, but diverse enough to operate a data-driven technology. So you can think about it like the Corona app can be a chatbot or something like this. Everything that requires a lot of data to be actually operational in the end. So how did we do that? So we run a survey experiment, actually two. The first one with mTurk. Why did we choose mTurk? Because mTurk or mTurkers are actually very tech-savvy people. And if we would find an effect there, it would also most likely hold in another sample, which we then collected using Prolific. And here you see the samples much smaller, but it's only US citizens and it's census calibrated. So it should be representative for the US population. So there's a lot of data, don't worry about it. Lauri told me not to talk about the method, but only about the results. So that's what I'm going to do. So most of you from the IS literature, you know about the privacy calculus model, and what that tells you is that there's a trade-off between realizing the expected utility of disclosing your data, and on the other hand, avoiding the anticipated cost of a privacy violation, right? I mean, if you give your data to Instagram or whatever, then you can use the service, but at the same time, you have the risk that your data might get leaked. And for that reason, the first thing we tested was, is it that the risk of a data leakage is decisive for you to donate your data to such public good? And actually what we found is that risk is very decisive. So risk played a role in both samples, so this was externally valid. And then we checked, what about the impact? So we had two different types of domains we have been investigating. One was the health system, the other one was sustainable environment. And what we checked was, what happens to your data donation behavior if you increase the impact it has. So in other words, if you donate your data, this will reduce CO2 reductions, it will make yourself healthier potentially, and so on. Will this have an impact on your donation behavior? And we didn't see any impact here. So decisive was risk, or the risk of a leakage. So this is a pretty economics standard argument, utilitarian. But on the other hand, you could also have a moral argument where you say, well, probably people perceive it as the moral, or the right thing morally to do, to donate their data to such an app like the Corona app, right? Other people could be saved if you donate your data. And what we found was that actually the moral obligation that people perceived to donate their data to such a database was very decisive for them to give up their data. Then there's a literature in psychology and philosophy in particular showing that the moral obligation might actually be driven by something else. Namely, if the benefits are very high, you might feel that it then is the right thing to do morally to give your data. So it could be a mediative effect, saying that, you know, if the impact is very high of your data donations, you feel morally obliged to give your data, and then you actually do it. But we couldn't find such a mediative effect. So the effects existed independent. There was a moral obligation for people to donate their data. And if the risk of a data leakage was high, they wouldn't give up their data. So two more things we were interested in is, did it make a difference who operated the database that can actually use your data? And we actually showed people different choices. So it could be academia, the government, or private industry, respectively, all the time in the US. And what we found was that academia and the government were preferred over the private industry. On my last and next slide, I will tell you why people actually decided that way. So they would rather give their data to academia or the government. And these are all marginal effects. So it doesn't tell you that they wouldn't give their data never to private industry. But if they have a choice, they would rather go to academia and the government. And finally, we checked, because we know people have something which is called algorithm inversion, whether it made a difference for them, whether the algorithm that works with the data is human supervised or self-learning. But here we couldn't find a difference. So for the individuals, it didn't matter. In the prolific sample, there was a small difference. So here they rather wanted to have a self-learning algorithm, but we didn't investigate this further, why that was the case. However, we checked why people preferred to give their data to government or the private industry. And as you mentioned before, with the Edward Snowden case and so on, it's rather surprising that, or maybe it's not surprising that people, well, actually it's surprising that people would rather give their data to the government and not to academia or the private industry. And the first thing you see, these are significance levels. It only tells you that there's a significance difference in favor, respectively, of academia and the government. And now the question is, why would people rather give their data to academia or the government? And so what we did was we ran regressions where we included a lot of variables, but here are only the most important ones. So first of all, if people believed that the private industry is very profit-oriented and this is their main goal, then they would not be as likely to donate their data to the private industry, meaning that profit orientation actually made people decay from donating their data to the private industry. At the same time, if individuals believe that the private industry is very trustworthy, then they were more likely to give their data to the private industry. So that was, in a very short nutshell, what we found in the paper. If you're interested in the results, how we derived them, feel free to get the data. It's open access. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Excellent, Lars. Thank you very much. We have a short comment on the paper by our great colleague, Philipp Hacke, professor in law and ethics here at the ENS. And similar to Lars, Lars also has a slight legal background, so I thought it was a perfect match to ask Philipp to say a few words about this paper. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great pleasure really to be at this venue and also for this really important special issue. Congrats to all those who made it in, also to Lars. I can say that my personal story with Lars is actually when I was a young postdoc back at Humboldt University. Now there was another young guy, but he was already tenured professor, Lars Klön, and he told me when he was moving in, he was actually in a project, really famous project in crowdfunding, together with this guy, Lars Horno. So I was like, ooh, this must be an important dude. Then I met him, we met virtually at the seminar actually before. So it's a great pleasure to meet you here again virtually and hopefully next time in person. So on the paper, I don't want to go through all the details of the paper. One question though that I would have is to see, from the data, as you said, it's going to be open source. Is there any effect, would there be any effect on trust in government, depending on who is the current U.S. president? So it would be interesting to see whether the data was actually collected while Trump was president, or when Biden was already president, or when we have a DeSantis president. I would suspect there might be some differences, but that might depend very much on your political inclinations. Nevertheless, I can just say that, of course, from a more general background in the law, is data sharing is a supreme concern from both the legal and the policy perspective. And so I'm taking just a step back to advance like 4 perhaps major fields or issues that came to mind to me. And I'm going to finish, of course, with ChatGPT, but beginning by saying that at the moment, we have different policy initiatives at the EU level, and there's really room for new research, both from an empirical and theoretical, and particularly also combined perspective. So the first one would be, because the paper is also about hacking, about data breaches, is IT security. And the EU is currently in the process of passing new legislation, the Cyber Resilience Act, actually, that will link in with other aspects of IT security regulation, try to set up a framework for common standards in devices, particularly also connected devices across the EU, which of course, and that relates to the talk that we had, the brilliant talk we had before by Mikla, on sensing war and the challenges of collecting information and storing information safely under constraints of the Ukraine war. That is something that is of supreme importance, of course, where the concept and the practice of IT security is becoming ever more challenging these days. So that's one aspect of securing your data and keeping it secure. Second point, of course, when you think about these data puzzles and social dilemmata, you could think about intermediaries facilitating the donation of data. This is also an idea that's quite relevant in the EU legal space. And here we have the Data Governance Act, the DGA, which tries to foster these ideas by, for example, designing for agencies or NGOs that could actually register and become kind of trustworthy intermediaries to collect data and then to work on them and share them based on collective agreements. So that's also kind of a new angle to it. A third aspect that's really important is, of course, data access. Now, because if you're sharing with one party, and for example, you might have an account with, I don't know, Twitter, but now you think Twitter is really shit because of this new dude who's in control of Twitter. And I personally, I post nothing on Twitter anymore. I've never posted anything, but I was on the verge of joining when Musk took over. I thought, I'm not going to give any of my data to this dude. And so, and help him with his business model. So if you think that that's a bad idea, you can actually download, get all of your info under the GDPR, for example, and put it to get it to another provider. Now, this is something that is becoming ever more crucial with Internet of Things applications, of course, when you think about automotive applications, and not only B2C, but also B2B. And this is something that's addressed in the Data Act, which is going to open up a huge field of applications, particularly in B2B connections. So if you think about, Lufthansa or any airline that has data on the Boeings and Airbuses that they're flying, and they want to have that data for predictive maintenance, but at the moment it's with Boeing and Airbus. So, and the Data Act actually gives them an opportunity to collect that data and to share it, again, potentially via intermediaries to do research on it and to run their own models. So this is about the emergence really of a real new data space in the EU, which is going to be, I think, of quite some importance. And the fourth thing, and I'm going to end with this, of course, is ChatGPT. And in fact, we've just written a paper, it's just been accepted to ACM Fact, which is a nice conference in my field. It's called Regulating ChatGPT by myself and two colleagues. And we look at different points in the data spectrum along ChatGPT, particularly with respect to the AI Act and the DSA, but also, and that's what I want to finish it with, the GDPR, because there was this famous decision, of course, by the Italian Data Protection Authority to take ChatGPT offline because of data protection concerns, precisely the kinds of data sharing concerns that are also addressed in the paper. And because some people actually are not happy with, data being leaked or data being manipulated, data being used at all for different purposes. So what are the two issues? The first issue is really about training data. So how is it that, ChatGPT is using data straight from the internet? Can you actually use it? And both from a copyright and a data protection perspective, this raises really important questions. And the second problem then is about the prompts. When you put in prompts, those might actually constitute personal data as well, such as, write me an invitation for my birthday party, which is taking place on my birthday on January XYZ. And the question is, does OpenAI store these? And if yes, what is it doing with it? And the Italian authority basically had 3 points. They said, this is not transparent. So it's, again, as Lauri said, it's not OpenAI, it's closed AI. Second point is protection of minors, also big topic where we had a big hearing in US Congress, as you know, TikTok manipulation of minors. And the third point then is really about the legal basis. Can you actually do this under the GDPR? And here there's really a lot of room for debate because OpenAI then changed some of its models, really changed the way in which ChatGPT stores the history. You can now opt out of personal data collection, but this core point is still unaddressed. Can you use data from the internet, scraped somehow under copyright and the GDPR, to then train your models on it. I think that answer will have to be quite granular, but the Italian Data Protection Authority actually, very surprisingly, said after a very short period of time, very little review. Well, that's fine. We're fine with that. Okay, well, you can go back online. And actually, the European Data Protection Board is now taking up the topic, and I'm going to be curious to see if that might lead to further infringements of the use of ChatGPT and further unavailability in the EU. In fact, if you just ask me, I think it would have to be taken down at the moment, and until OpenAI is not such a misnomer under its own terms anymore. Okay, so this is just a very quick take on that. I think that we will absolutely see much more work, both from an empirical and a legal side and theoretical side, addressing questions of data governance, data sharing practices going forward as we're moving into an ever more connected digital space, Internet of Things, AI tools, bringing it all together. And that's why this is such a timely paper. I congratulate you, Lars, and your co-authors for a really fantastic piece, and Lauri and the other editors to a really great volume here. Thanks so much for having us, and enjoy the rest.
Thank you very much, Philip. Great. So then we can move on to the brief presentation of the next paper, which is by Dragana Paparova and co-authors on data governance spaces, the case of a national digital health service, digital service for personal health data. I'm sorry about that. Thanks a lot for joining the call, and it was a pleasure working with you on the paper. I'll say a few words about the paper afterwards, but right now I'm really much looking forward to your presentation. Welcome. Oop, I think you're muted.
Yes, I am. Thanks for that. I hope you can hear me now.
Very well.
Yes, that's good. Thank you, Lauri, for the short introduction, and also to the special issue editors for working with us so hard throughout the revision rounds, and also, of course, to the anonymous reviewers, if any of them are around. My name is Dragana. I am a PhD research fellow at the Department of Information Systems at the University of Agder, and together with my supervisor, Margun Anesta, who is also on the call, and two of our colleagues, Polikseni Vassilopoulou and Marianne Bachus, all of them from University of Agder in Norway, we co-authored the paper Data Governance Spaces in the case of a national digital service for personal health data. Conceptually, we based the paper on some limitations of the reliance on the IT governance literature as a conceptual background for data governance, which Lauri already mentioned in the introductory presentation, such as IT governance being organization focused, focusing on strategic purposes of organizations, but also treating data as just another type of IT assets governed and commonly positioning them in the areas of IT architecture. Instead, we raised the need for exploring inter-organizational data governance, which is empirically understudied as of now, and the sharing of data across multiple actors which can use and share and produce these data for various purposes. We showed how data are different, or claimed how data are different than other types of IT assets governed, because they are semantic, they are use agnostic, but also because they can be either openly shared or prone to intellectual property rights of organizations, or be personal data which are based on strict laws and regulations on how this sharing can take place. We conducted a case study in the Norwegian healthcare sector, a case study of a national citizen portal called Health Norway, and we followed its 10-year evolution of adding functionalities for sharing data. Even though we focused on one portal, this portal is governed by a product board of various healthcare actors, including Directorate of Health, Directorate of e-Health, specialist healthcare services, municipal services, and all of them renegotiate which functionalities should be added further on. We mapped 8 functionalities, which were significant over time, but I will not go in details over that, and defined 5 data governance arrangements of how data governance changed over time in Health Norway. I will shortly just give an overview over a few. For instance, the first functionality was providing insight into data about citizens stored in healthcare registries, such as vaccinations. In this case, the Health Register Act directly appointed the healthcare registries as data controllers, and Health Norway could only process data on behalf of these data controllers and could only view but not copy these data in its own storage. Some years after that, they also had a data storage where they provided a new functionality allowing citizens to exchange messages with GP EPR systems. In this case, we had two data controllers where the GP EPR owners could store these data about patients based on the Health Record Act, but Health Norway could store these data based on citizens' consent. Some of the last functionalities were providing digital health apps provided by private vendors, such as, for instance, for mental health, where there was no shared data controlling. Instead, citizens were redirected from Health Norway to the digital health app, and the legal basis at the two places were separate, and they were based on a separate consent by the citizens. We contributed to the data governance literature and governing data across multiple actors in various ways. First, by emphasizing the role of data, where we differentiated between handling data and handing data over. In the case of data handling, multiple actors could process data on behalf of someone else who specifies uniform purposes for this data processing. And in the case of handing data over, multiple actors could copy data and each of them could determine different purposes for their own data processing. We also differentiated between two types of data governance dynamics: vertical, where actors were subordinated to an authority which was defining the rules for data governance, and horizontal, where actors were multiplicating their authority, rights, roles, and responsibilities, and each could define their own rules for data governance. Lastly, we defined the concept of data governance spaces, which highlights three aspects. One, that it's a multi-actor space where one actor could take different roles depending on who they have a relationship with. For instance, they could be a processor for one processing of data and a controller for another. These data governance spaces are also characterized by authorized relationships, and also they have clear boundaries at which the responsibility about data transfers from one actor to another. That's it from my part. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dragana. Excellent presentation. Let me give a few comments on the paper, because I was also the leading handling editor on the paper, and it's one of the very great examples for where we wanted to take this special issue. In the initial round of all the papers that we received, we had quite often the framing of an initial submission that authors would address a clearly increasingly important societal question, as Dragana and her team did, yet they would use classical IT governance literature and sort of cloak the findings into the nomenclature we know from this literature. So very strategic, very firm driven. And in many papers, we over time sort of asked the author to focus on the shift in the level of the analysis you have. You go from organization to inter-organization level, and all of a sudden, a whole new set of questions emerges. And it was very important for us, and this paper is a very good case of that, where we shift from looking at the organization to an ecosystem or an inter-organizational setup. And then we see a new space emerging. All of a sudden, data governance isn't a clear-cut question of just generating that one type of value. It becomes a question of different authorities asking for different things. We have new roles that emerge and new practices related to the data handling. And all these intricacies we wanted to highlight with the special issue. And this paper brings them to the fore so nicely. I could relate to the paper in many ways. The one is that I'm also having an adjunct position in Norway, and we look at a large IT infrastructure and healthcare there. But the others, of course, that we've seen, I guess, around Europe and perhaps around the world, these processes where these large infrastructures are attempted to be implemented, and then these complex dynamics unfold. And what I really like about the paper is this clear-cut argument of we go from the organizational to the inter-organizational level, and then we have a whole new set of dynamics, new actors, new complexities that emerge. And I believe it holds a lot of potential for the future of healthcare delivery and research on IS more generally, as we, of course, in the healthcare space have a tremendously important industry at hand, where some believe and others are more skeptical, but they all agree that data will be important for creating value in the future. Data from different sources, different devices, different levels of individual intimacy. And I think this paper will be very, very central for us to better understand the dynamics that unfold, because we are just at the beginning of seeing these different data sources come together and the questions that are associated with this coming together. So Dragana, thank you for pulling through the review process. I know I'm a tormentor. I've been told that in the process of getting the special issue together. But it was, I think it was for the best. It is a very great paper. I'm looking forward to it becoming very well cited and read. So thank you for being here and a great paper. And talking about data and healthcare, it's a pleasure to now hand over to Sirka Järvenpää for her presentation of her paper with Anna Essen.
All right, thank you so much for including us. We were very excited to be part of this special issue. Also want to mention that I'm on the other side of Germany at the moment, in Münster, where I'm staying for a few weeks. So our paper is a call to arms to move from what we consider as a rather current, real-time or near-time focus of data into a longer-term perspective. And so the paper advances this notion of a data sustainability, the capacity of data to endure across technological and human generations. Generations could be decades, but they also could be hundreds of years. So how can we make the data live forever, in a sense? If we look at the current data governance literature, we would argue that it takes a rather natural life cycle view into data, that data is born and data dies, just like the flowers. If we look at the ways that practice, particularly consultants like to talk about data, it's rather different view. Data is forever. You know, if we contrast data to code, code is seen as more transient. Models, data models are generational. But data can be there forever as long as the storage costs are low enough. I was recently attending CERN conference, and of course CERN is this world-renowned research center on nuclear research, and they have tons of data. They actually have to come up with new terms for describing the volumes of data that they have. But several speakers, very interesting, actually had statements like data lives forever. So how can we ensure the infrastructure to support the long life? But we would argue, Anna and myself, that if you look at the data practice studies, so the studies that are really asking the data users, how far back can you go? Oftentimes you can't even go to yesterday, because no one knows where the data is, who is the owner, has it been kept up to date? I had an opportunity to attend a session at South by Southwest conference in Austin this spring, a session on Where's My Movie? The panelists were all movie producers or movie directors, and many of them had really heartbreaking stories that movies that they had created in 1990s and had received awards were nowhere to be found. All right, so really speaking to how digital data can be very fragile. of course, there are examples how investments, particularly societal investments in data, pay off. And coming originally from Finland, I'd like to have an example from Finland. So here is a study that used data where biosamples gained 50 years ago and really discovered very valuable findings for today and even for tomorrow. An article that referred to this Lyme disease study had a very profound statement in terms of how we oftentimes think that legacy data is really costly, how legacy samples and legacy data can really be a better way for discoveries. So in this particular paper, we very much build on shoulders of others who have come. Karuth and Keman have a fantastic perspective that they wrote on a topic of sustainability. They took 3 different philosophical approaches, evolutionary, relational, and durability. And in this thought piece, Anna and I myself are really looking at kind of the data travels over different socio-technical infrastructures from a kind of evolutionary perspective. We take kind of the relational view into data, looking at the social life of data. Who are the actors that the data is associated? Looking at genomics marketplaces, we oftentimes find very different rules for academics versus industry people in terms of use of the data. So again, how the data longevity really is impacted by the social life of data. And then lastly, the durability view. And this is really, to what extent are we able to go back in time and bring the data present? And that, of course, what happened with the Lyme disease study. They brought data that had been collected 50 years ago to be relevant to today's problems. So hopefully you find in your research where taking a longer term perspective brings additional insight. So we are very much looking forward to any new extensions, and of course, going beyond the 3 perspectives that we borrowed in this particular article. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for the presentation of the paper. It's a very, very great paper, and it came at a time when I was talking to a historian and I was telling him about what we would in IS or organizations theory settle for when we say long-term perspective. It could be like a 10 years, 20 years maybe study of IT implementation or something else. And then the historian like mildly laughed and said, look, what you call long-term is like yesterday for us. We look at decades, centuries, even decades is considered very little time. And it was a very nice submission or contribution of yours to the special issue to uncover this long-term perspective on the role of data that currently, as you said, is being considered as extremely important and is increasingly developed upon in the data as practice perspective, yet it has or potentially has this very, very, very long-term perspectives that can move on even centuries of thinking. And I really like the conceptual approach you're taking with the borrowing from Garut and Gaiman 3 perspectives of how data travels. And it really sensitizes for this idea that not only are we producing masses of data right here, right now, but all that data might be available at some point into the unknown for being of value for somebody. And then the question, how does that become possible? I think it was a really thought-provoking piece in the sense that we also rarely see in IS this very, very, very long-term perspective, this legitimately historical perspective, if you want. So this was one of the aspects I really like. I'm really inclined to do these long-term process studies with decades or centuries. I think it's a really, really interesting question. And I think what the potential of data holds for going 50 years into the future, 100 years into the future, of course, we don't know, but it will be very interesting. I think this paper is one that is very thought-provoking in this regard. And thank you again for contributing it. It was a pleasure working with you on the paper.
Thank you.
All right. Now, from very long-term perspective to sprint events, which we also talked about earlier, over to Thomas Gegenhuber, who has an exciting paper about hackathons.
Hi, thank you. This is really a great event. Thanks for the special issue and bringing together such an interdisciplinary crowd. I absolutely enjoyed the discussions and the discussions. Think back into the first week of the lockdown of the Corona crisis. You know, when it really hit at us, when we were sitting in our flats and didn't know what to do. And it was in this time when a few people and few civic tech organizations in Germany thought, hey, what about if we bring people from all different areas of society together to work on digital solutions for the Corona crisis? And this was the Wir versus Virus hackathon. It was up to date one of the largest hackathons of the world. Ultimately, around 24,000 people. It was organized within a week, produced about 1,500 ideas. And out of these 1,500 ideas, about 150 ideas were put into an implementation program. And about all of these, I would say 30 to 50 unfold some kind of impact. And why do we study this from a data governance perspective? I think it's people coming together, exchanging data and information, working on digital solutions, and data and information is key to that. But as we saw in the prior presentations, and when you think about thousands of people coming together, data governance is a multi-stakeholder phenomenon in such a case as Wir versus Virus. You have the organizers, you have thousands of participants, you have supporting organizations, etc., etc., etc. So it becomes really quite complicated, and no single actor determines data governance. Of course, an organizer can say, hey, we want to support open source, or we want to support the usage of certain tools. But at the end, because it's such a large amount of different stakeholders, there's no single actor who can decide upon what the data governance in such an instance should look like. And what we try to do in this paper is really thinking about what is a framework that helps us understanding data governance in these settings. And we boiled it down to 3 key dimensions. The first one is openness. So when we think about public issue, public code, public money, public code, you know, like this idea, if we work towards the common good, it should be open source, open data. And I think that speaks to all of us. So why does it speak to all of us? Because especially in times of crisis, if we share data, we can build on each other's results, we can ease collaboration barriers. So kind of fostering an openness logic in such phenomena intuitively makes sense. And indeed, this is what the organizers did. They sought to foster open source, etc., etc. The second dimension we think is important is accountability. You need to provide explanations and justifications for your action. And then you can see openness is not always the best choice or the most feasible choice. One example is an application. It was the Udo app that helped people to fill out applications for a work subsidy program of the federal government. And here we saw the Udo app didn't, use an API. So all the applications they helped to fill out were, in contact with the Federal Work Agency, they just help them to fill out, and then you need to submit it by paper. And why was it so? Because the Federal Work Agency was, accountable for their action. They can not just rapidly develop an API for such a sensitive data area. And the third dimension we looked at is power. Because what does it mean, power? If people come together from all the different areas of society, we think of, it's sharing, it's caring, everyone is equal because we're all in the same boat to solving problems. But no, in multi-stakeholder phenomena, we know some people are more powerful actors than others. Civil society doesn't have the same power as established actors. And indeed, we could see that some solutions of civil society that were actually would have been helpful in addressing the crisis, ultimately were stopped by some actors within the government who were not sharing the openness and enthusiasm of other parts of the government. And in concluding that's in a nutshell what we want to achieve in our paper. And we think openness, accountability, and power are important dimensions to capture dynamics of such multi-stakeholder data governance. Thank you.
Excellent, Thomas. Thank you very much. And of course, these three aspects are also key to researchers in the area of political science. And I would like to welcome your commentator, Mike Coburn, from the European New School of Digital Studies, who's not only a follower of the Premier League as I am, but also a postdoc at the chair of digital democracy and political theory. Thanks, Mike, for taking over the comment here.
Very happy to do so. I'm guessing you can hear me okay there?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so as Lauri says, I'm coming at this work primarily from a political science perspective, but also kind of from a political communication and more broadly, I guess, a digital democracy perspective. And so for me, the main thing that this work does is it really asks us to rethink open social innovations from within to kind of collectively identify challenges, to better specify problems, and also to create solutions. So I have here, given that you've got three kind of main points, I've got three main comments and then some concluding. So the first main comment I had in this that was of interest to me, I really got to even within the literature review. So this was this perspective that data governance would be thought of as primarily a question for the corporate sphere that is only now emerging or only recently emerging as a societal question. So coming from a political science perspective, we would primarily see data governance and indeed governance more generally as a societal first question. And we would understand corporations' governance procedures as merely reflecting a combination of kind of regulatory requirements and societal norms and values. And so given that this issue seeks to directly address the data governance as a societal question, I, as a political scientist, I'm very happy to see this work, not just in this paper, but also in the issue more broadly. I'm also interested in the question of why you think this hasn't been a central focus in the previous literature. And again, so coming from outside of the literature, this trend to me appears likely connected to the focus on the implications of governance for what tend to be termed here innovators, and in terms of innovation more broadly, which seems to be kind of valorized as a normative good, which again, coming from a political science or even a political theory perspective, I think that's contestable. But I found that super interesting. And like I say, in terms of the direction of the issue and this paper specifically, like that is in line with what I would have wanted to see. And so that was great. Secondly, the focus on power resonated with me in particular in this paper. So again, I'm coming from a discipline whose main object of interest is power. This is often often encapsulated in Harold Laswell's famous quote, quote, "Politics is the study of who gets what, when, and how," end quote. And this focus on power, I agree with the analysis in this paper, is absolutely central in these OSIs as well. And again, similar to the political world, it seems to me that power here appears about as much about who gets to set the rules, rather than who has formal power over activity in the organization. So again, this is reminded me of a somewhat famous and rather crude quotation from the former Congressman John Dingell, quote, "If I let you write the substance and you let me write the procedure, I'll screw you every time," end quote. So again, given the centrality of questions of power in my discipline, I was a bit surprised to see how recent a lot of the literature here was, but once again, very happy to see it being given more attention. And I would have maybe liked to see more elaboration in terms of if they see any hierarchy in terms of these questions of openness, accountability, and power, as again, that might be some kind of disciplinary differences that we have there. And then my final comment comes in really in regard to how representative this case study of Vir versus virus is. So from my perspective, this example became a somewhat famous case study in how not to engage communities. So again, I live in Germany and I'm kind of politically aware of what Vir versus virus was. And I certainly noted that there were kind of problems ranging from a lack of diversity. So they had a lot of problems with all white juries, consistently rejecting projects and funding for anti-racism programs against the Asian community in Germany, a lack of responsiveness to criticisms, partnership with some big tech companies, and that point is addressed really nicely in this paper. And also this example of the employment of people experiencing homelessness. So given these challenges, I wonder what the normative lessons future OSIs should learn from the experience of Vir versus virus. And more generally, are these criticisms and problems somewhat representative for OSIs and therefore generalizable, or were these specific failures of Vir versus virus, again, perhaps related to either the project scale or the speed in which they tried to get things going at the start of it. And again, I think the paper is really strong here, because from my reading, the dimensions of openness, accountability, and especially for me, power, suggested in the paper offer a pretty compelling way for future projects to think about and potentially avoid some of these issues that have negatively affected Vir versus virus. And given the structure of OSIs, a central question also appears to me to be whether and how these organizations reinforce or are able to challenge traditional hierarchies of power in the society in which they exist. So again, just to quote that example of all white juries twice rejecting funding for this anti-racism program against Asians, appears a useful case study here for future OSIs to kind of think about. And again, this framework of openness, accountability, and power are a really useful toolkit to tackle these questions. So just to finish, I would say that these questions highlight kind of some of the benefits of interdisciplinarity, that we can engage with these problems from a variety of questions. So for example, my discipline, political science, is particularly poorly placed to answer questions about these kind of corporate-led governance or organization-led governance. And I really learned a lot from this, about this in terms of a distinct perspective of a case study that in my discipline is perceived very, very negative. So that was super interesting, and thank you very much for a great piece of research.
Great, excellent. Fantastic comments. Thank you so much, Mike. We'll move on to the next paper on data governance and the secondary use of data, and the presentation by Humza.
Okay, thank you, Lauri. I would like to first greet everyone from Melbourne, Australia. So we are at 10th of May here, so it's very early morning, but it's good. I would start by acknowledging that I'm also a Premier League fan, and I'll be staying up to watch Champions League, so it's very good for me. Okay, so just the authors team, we are from University of... Sorry?
Oh, there was applause.
Okay, I'll start again. So the authors team is... Okay. Okay, so the others team are from University of Melbourne and myself is from RMIT University. Just a little bit of background on us. So we were all returning to academia. We were practitioners working in the data domain. So we will just give you reflections, how we came up with this research and what are the reflections mostly from the practice perspective, but also giving you the research contributions. And special thanks to Elizabeth Davidson for being the specialty editor who handled our paper. It was a great learning journey for us coming from the practice, how to craft an academic paper and produce a good outcome. So thank you very much. Okay, so why our study is important? We have framed it on a very contemporary topic, which we call as data activation. So this has been explored a lot in terms of how do organizations use data to make the informed decisions, but also how do you develop data products in the current age using AI, machine learning, different models. But mostly the organization do it in the form of primary data, but our focus is on secondary use of data. So what we mean by that is organizations develop a, you can say, philosophy and collect data in order to complete a transaction or a service that they deliver to their customers. So that's a primary use, but any use beyond that transaction or service leads to a secondary use of data. So that's what we mean by secondary use of data. And once we go into the realm of secondary use of data, it becomes a data governance problem. So how do you become compliant in terms of, can we invest in this kind of initiative? Who would then lead that initiative in the organization? Do we have the risk kind of analysis to drive that initiative? So who is responsible for doing all of these activities in the organization? And we thought it's the board's responsibility to give the initiative and also drive it from that perspective. And then it leads down to top level management and then the operational part as well. So to confirm this, I'm just going to share a few insights from the board members itself. So these are some of the quotes that I'm sharing. And the first one is saying whose responsibility it is. And the board member is saying it's the board responsibility, and then it should translate to the management. But it's not just the responsibility, what happens afterwards. So once you realize that data has a lot of potential, and maybe the primary use of data, we acknowledge all of it, but the second use of data, then the alarm bells can ring in an organization. Are we equipped to invest in this? What's the legal perspective on this? Are we compliant to do so as well? So there is a lot of unknowns in terms of once we go into the direction of secondary use of data. So this is from the importance perspective. So in terms of capturing it in the form of research questions, so we were more interested in what factors are associated with differences in the board strategic positions or orientations on the governance of the second use of data. And in particular, in what ways do these factors combine to form different data archetypes? So this was our focus, to give some practice-based outcomes to say this is how you actually invest in this and how you can actually play in the realm of second use of data. So to address research question one, we did a qualitative study with 41 board of directors. All of them were NED members. And we came up with this framework to explain the perspectives from three angles. First one is from the environmental perspective, then the individual and the organizational. You can see what we have developed here inductively from the qualitative data, but I will just give you the most surprising output that we didn't see here. So if you see, the technology readiness is not here. All of us are more focused on technology in terms of how much the board understand it, and the readiness of the organization internally to go on such a journey in terms of transformation or using data would be the main factor, but it didn't come across as any of the, you can say, factors that we have combined here. And then we came up with two sets of outcomes. Either you see data as a key enabler. So whenever I'm saying data is the secondary use of data, or the data as a minimal source of advantage for the organization. So whichever outcome you choose, then we came up with the configurations to explain how you can actually excel in any of these outcomes. So if you are a board who has a focus on data as the key enabler of your strategy in the organization, then you either fall in the active board. So you are proactive in nature, you already have governance mechanisms in place, and then you can invest and then go beyond and go to see competitive advantage. The other one is discomforted. This means that the board has the understanding of the potential of secondary use of data, but they want to know, change the organizational direction or maybe go in a different direction, and they acknowledge that they understand the data usage and they are now going in that direction. Once we go to the other part, data as a minimal source of competitive advantage, so we can have a passive board which doesn't have a defined orientation for the governance of second use of data, or then a content board as well. So we are happy with whichever way we are proceeding with our competitive advantage. We are not thinking about going in a different direction. through data, and we are quite contented with what we have at this stage. So these are a few configurations that we came up with. To complement these, we developed a calibrated metrics as well in terms of how you can situate yourself across these configurations. And then this can help organizations to self-assess in terms of where they are, in terms of their initial stage, and then they can go to the target stage as well. So you can start from maybe passive, but you want to transition to active. So there are certain, you can say, metrics that you can see to transition from passive to active. Okay, so contributions in terms of literature on data governance. So I think we came up with unique perspectives and unique participants as well. There aren't many studies at the board level. To get hold of them or to get their perspective of any IS issue is a key contribution. And we are explaining how secondary use of data as a key enabler or a minimal on the data strategy perspective. Then contribution mostly on the strategic management literature broadly. So we are acknowledging that secondary use of data is a latent resource. If you see, current literature is saying data is a latent resource, particularly from the resource-based view theory perspective. So once we talk about VRI and properties, they may emerge later on. You don't realize them at the start once you start using data to see competitive advantage, but they may come later on. So our study provides that evidence. But then it challenges in terms of what are the conditions in terms of how organizations should change it from latent resource to more active resource. So this is what we then talk about in the paper. Then implications for practice. So we have all heard from 2007 from Davenport's book, Competing on Data. But now we are talking more about how do you transition a board's big data governance strategy when it comes to second use of data. And still you are competing on data, but it's a different flavor. And finally, we are just talking about individual organizational and environmental factors, and they have an influence on board view how to govern the second use of data. And we talk about in detail from the practice perspective what it means. Okay, so just the two key takeaways from our paper. The first one is all of us can think about if we have a board combination and we have an active board member who understands data, that will help us to maybe craft a strategy on second use of data. We didn't come up with this kind of finding. So having an individual who have experience with data is useful, but it's not a defining factor. And board as a whole should be interested or engaged to design the future of the organization. The second one came back to the point that I raised earlier about technical readiness of the organization. So it's mostly external in our case, in terms of you understand the relevant data which is coming from outside the organization, and you understand how to invest in it and get maximum value out of it. It's not inside the organization in terms of technical readiness. All of the organizations mostly are equipped to invest and do well with the data, but it's mostly the outside perspective that emerged as the key finding or takeaway from our findings and results. So this is what I would like to share with you. Happy to have any questions or comments. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And we have a few comments from Liz Davidson again. Thanks for joining in so early. I know it's daunting early in Hawaii.
Well, thank you. This was a fun paper to work with on many levels, to work with people who are with a lot of time in the IT industry and practice and making the jump to academia. That's another kind of border and integration of views, as well as the disciplinary views within academia. What I found intriguing about the paper is that although, our title says grand challenges, and we were looking very, very much at the societal and interorganizational, that we do remember that data governance happens on the ground within individual organizations, many of them commercial organizations that are collecting and generating data, and that this paper elevated the view of what organizational data governance is from what's often the IT role. It's the IT department or the auditing department or the accounting department or the compliance department that takes care of it, to say that it is and should be a strategic issue, and that the board of directors has a role and responsibility in understanding what the organization is doing with their own data, and as well as their secondary use of data that they bring in and may combine. This is becoming so much more critical and relevant because there's so much data exchange going on in the marketplaces. So I thought the topic was interesting, and across the span of papers we had in the special issue, we had papers that looked at the individual level, the organizational level, the intra-organizational level, the societal level, and this felt, I thought this paper filled in our special issue a very important aspect of that range of understanding of governance. I also like the paper very much methodologically as a combination of a combination in the first part of going to practitioners and asking them what they thought, what they were doing, and using a combination of theoretically informed and grounded theory to come up with the criteria. And that resulted in some interesting findings that were not typically looked at in other research. So I thought I liked that part of it. But then I got really intrigued by the qualitative case comparative method, and the authors went through quite a few iterations to try to satisfy reviewers and to really bring that to a level of excellence. And I thought that this paper, in addition to being a very interesting paper on the data governance topic that complements our special issue and brings general knowledge, it's methodologically very interesting. Jenifer Winter and I are working on a number of topics. We're looking at how different forms of governance organizations come into being, and this paper, working on it, really helped me to think about and understanding how comparative case analysis might be used, what it might, how we might see different configurations coming together. In this case, it was looking at configurations of boards and strategies, but I could see it being even more broadly applicable. So I have to thank the authors again for going through the multiple rounds and their rigor and dedication to making their paper as clearly written and as informative as it is. So I think that's generally my comments, Lauri.
Okay, excellent. Then on to the final paper on data governance and digital innovation, a translational account of practitioner issues by Gregory Vial. Which will be an excellent showcase of what a RIG paper looks like. It's the RIG paper in the special issue. So remember what Michael said earlier about the RIG section, which is particularly interested in impact. And this is a very nice example for an excellent RIG paper.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I know I'm the last one that stands between the drinks and the rest of the evening or the day, so I'll make it very quick. Just want to take a second to thank everyone involved in the preparation for the special issue. It's been really interesting to work on the paper and to also see the papers that are out right now. Lots of diversity, very interesting, and I look forward to having the time to read all of them during the summer. So I'll give a very brief overview of the paper and the process through which it was developed. Basically, it's born out of teaching executives about data governance in the big data context. And it's essentially about originally leveraging what we know from research to inform practitioners. But over time, through the experience of discussing and holding workshops with practitioners, it's become the opposite as well. So using practice as a way to help us think about our research. So it's kind of an unexpected twist, if you will, of what the teaching experience was like. And over time, it built up into a series of elements that were recurring over these discussions during the workshops, and things that I was trying to find, for instance, in our research, and I couldn't necessarily find, or that not necessarily from the angle that practitioners were looking for. And this is where the idea, when the special issue call was issued, was to try to see, oh, maybe that could be an interesting RIC submission, because it's not a traditional paper that's planned out with a research question ahead of time. It's more of the result of an iterative process through engaged pedagogy, if you will. And the core issue that the paper seeks to talk about is really something that's fundamental to how practitioners in the workshops think about data governance. It's really the tension that exists between trying to maximize the value of data or information while at the same time protecting it. So there's this idea that if you try to do digital innovation through data, you will necessarily almost have to relax some of the constraints you might put on protecting the information or that data. And in doing so, you might expose yourself to certain risks. And what that means is some companies are extremely reluctant to doing that. For instance, we can think about banks, financial institutions, healthcare agencies, and whatnot. And what they do then is have kind of a default reflex of saying, well, we'll innovate less, but we'll protect information because that's really where we stand as an organization. As we get more and more access to data and we have more and more capabilities, these practitioners are looking at trying to find the right balance. And this is something that was already mentioned in several articles on data governance, including the Talon et al. Article from 2013 in JMIS, which is this core issue or tension that exists and that organizations that have traditionally not necessarily been very data savvy are trying to wrestle with at this point. So the good news is through this experience, I've really come to appreciate how research has been able to make the results as something very appealing for practitioners. So in preparing the workshops and delivering them, I rely a lot on frameworks and articles that emerge from the realm of research. And we always talk in IS about rigor and relevance as being increasingly important, And what I found is we actually had very relevant research on data governance, and practitioners appreciate that, in part because a lot of the advice that's available in practitioner sources tends to be very exhaustive, discussing data governance programs rather than small iterative approaches, for example. And what it means is it often appears as a very daunting task to undertake. So these workshops and the scientific work I can use during those workshops has been very tremendously helpful to try to structure discussions and help people reflect on the issues that they face in a certain way so that we can move forward. Now, at the same time, recurringly, as I was saying, there's a number of issues that seem to be still nagging practitioners and for which I didn't necessarily have the ability to find a lot of scientific work on. And this really was the idea behind the paper, was to try to extract or find what those core issues are to design a research agenda that's for IS research, but that's based on current practitioner issues. So the idea is to build on those issues to see how IS research could help using existing conceptual foundations or contributing to existing conceptual foundations in doing so. So the agenda is structured around four main themes. The first one is really about working on identifying how we can enable embrace data governance without compromising on digital innovation. Adopting a paradoxical view of approaching these two aspects could be one way to do so, to really consider them not as an either or, but more of a balanced approach that needs to be taken. The second theme is about trying to look more at what are the different configurations of governance mechanisms that can be put in place to gain certain results. We tend to look at data governance either as a large object or as micro practices, but there are relations that exist between, let's say, procedural, structural, and operational mechanisms that are put in place, and these create configurations of data governance in organizations. And studying these configurations has the potential to inform some of the concerns that practitioners have, because they're always trying to see, okay, how do we fit the different pieces of the puzzle? The third theme is really about figuring out how do we move from designing data governance to actually living through how we govern data. What do we actually do on a day-to-day basis, and how does that contribute to these overarching objectives we set up when we say we're going to govern our data? For a lot of companies, they have a plan on paper, and what happens is it doesn't necessarily translate well into practice, or they don't really see the fit between the two. So that's something they're very interested in, is seeing how what they do on an everyday basis contributes to achieving their data governance objectives. And the last theme, which was touched upon for some other papers, is this idea that some companies adopt a very traditional view of data governance that's squarely based on IT governance, which is oriented towards systems. But as we talk about data, we're moving toward really thinking about how do we serve data, whether it's within the organization or across organizations. More and more, we're talking about APIs, services. And for some organizations, it's a transition from thinking about data as something that resides within systems towards data as something that we provide through services. And that's one of the ways through which data governance can be enforced or can be applied. And these are really the four main themes that emerged from these recurring discussions with the practitioners. And like I said, I'll keep it very short. So that's the essence of the paper. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to work on this paper. Which was a great opportunity for me to look back on what I've done on this front, and thank you for all the people involved in the special issue.
Thank you very much, and I hand over to Susan Winter for a short comment on the paper.
All right, very short. As Gregory pointed out, we're all that stands between you and well, maybe some closing remarks between you and the drinks part of the program. But I really enjoyed working on this paper as an editor with Greg. I think there are a couple of things that I found particularly intriguing about this. One is part of why I work in the rigs area particularly is because I think increasingly society and business really wants us to solve problems. So when we talked about grand challenges as an editorial team, I think that the emphasis is on solving problems, and often this is couched as, should it be curiosity-driven research or applied research? And I think Greg's piece really points out that it's both, because Gregory was trying to use the theory to inform practitioners, and the practitioners were coming back and saying, well, what about this? And what about this? And some of the findings that Gregory had, I found really intriguing. So it was not just theory informing practice, but practice coming back and informing theory. And I think that Gregory's piece does a really nice job of saying, well, here's how I structure what I've got within an existing theoretical framework. Here's where the gaps are, and here are theories that could actually speak to this. Not just, here's a problem, someone figure it out, but here's a problem and here's a theory. Here are 3 theories that could speak to this, but we haven't done the work yet. And if we did the work, would this be a boundary case? Would this actually extend the theory? Would there be parts that it could move it forward? And I really like the idea of governance profiles. I think it's challenging us to step up and do more. And I think we're down to the end of our time. But thank you very much, Gregory. This was great.
Excellent. Thank you, Gregory and Susan, for talking through this very, very good rig paper. I know it's early in Hawaii, mid-noonish in the US, early in Australia, and early evening in Europe. I would like to thank you all very much for being here today. Are there any final comments or questions you want to raise here in the plenum, either here in the co-working space or virtually on the call? And just forget that there's this bar. They've actually taken the drinks down.
Very, very
Any final comments or questions to the authors? We'll be happy to share all slides afterwards and make them available so you can have a look at those.
I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. Those of you who are in person with Lauri, and those of you who are online. It's so exciting to work on a special issue and then to see so many people engage with it, both the authors engaging with their own work and with each other's work, and then the commentators who come in and bring different perspectives. So even without the promise of either coffee or wine at the end of the session, thanks to all of you who came online, and all of our authors in particular. It's after, sometimes I think when you do a special issue and you put a lot of work into it, all of the people involved in it, and then it's just done. And this is such a nice opportunity to enjoy it as a community, and also to get invigorated to do more research in this area that I think many of us are quite passionate about. So thank
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. Yeah, and I thank you all for being here, both on the call virtually and here in the co-working space. It was a great session to introduce all the papers to you. We'll be very happy to keep up the work and the collaboration to dig deeper into questions of data governance and grand challenges. I think this is only the beginning, not the ending of a journey, and I hope we'll see many more special issues emerge on the topic and many more great papers being done. Thank you all very much. And with that, without further ado, as we have it in Germany, we're now guiding into the informal part of the evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Everyone, bye.
Thank you all. Thanks for the presentation. Bye.